Thank you for joining us on GeoComm's Ask the Expert. The question we're talking about today is why is the site structure address point data included in the required layers for Next Generation 911? Well, actually, in earlier drafts of the NENA standard, it was not included in the list. But after a lot of discussion, it was determined that it should be moved up and work in conjunction with the road centerline data. Now, let's take a look at that list. That list includes your PSAP boundary, your provisioning boundary, your emergency service zone boundaries, and it includes the two location layers, that road centerline layer and your site structure address point layer, commonly referred to as address points. Now, because they are required layers, they need to be provisioned into the Nextgen 911 system. In the Nextgen 911 system, one of the functions of your GIS data is to validate those civic address locations prior to a 911 call. The other function in the Nextgen system is the routing of those calls into the correct 911 center. So that GIS data looks at the address, looks at the location that it falls in the GIS data to determine which PSAP to send the call to. Now, let's look at the road center line and the address point data and how they work. When you determine a location by a civic address using the road center line data, it actually looks at the ranges that have been applied to that segment to determine a calculated location for that address. But when you use an address point file, it represents the specific location of that structure. Could be a structure, could be a site, it could be actually an access point, maybe for a long driveway or an access point into a building. It may even represent a location of a landmark that doesn't have a civic address tied to it, but it is not a calculated location. It is a location that is determined when the data was built. Okay, so let's look at this in an example. In this particular example, we have address structures, or structures that were addressed off of Forum Boulevard. Okay, but later an access road was built, and that was given the name Colony Drive. However, the addresses of the structures off of Colony Drive were not readdressed. So if we geocode those addresses utilizing the road centerline file, we are going to show access off of Forum Boulevard. Okay, you can understand what process and difficulty that may be from a response standpoint, because the location actually shows access off of a different road. Whereas if we are looking at the address point file in displaying that location, they would locate correctly and show the correct access off of Colony Drive. Now let's look at that same example, but from a Nextgen 911 standpoint. As an example, if the PSAP boundary fell along Forum Boulevard or adjacent to Forum Boulevard, would the geocoded addresses fall within the correct PSAP boundary? May or may not. If we look at the address point location, would they fall within the correct PSAP boundary? In this example, yes, they would. But you also have to remember that in creating these PSAP boundaries, these data layers work as backup with each other. So you have to make sure that your geocoded location and your address point locations fall within the correct PSAP boundary. Now, there's two things that we want you to remember in relationship to this address point file. It does not have to be complete for Next Generation 911, meaning you do not have to have every addressable structure or every location displayed within your address point file. If you are going to be building it, perhaps it's best to start with your problem areas, your addresses out of sequence, odds on the even side of the road, locations like that, and then build up into a complete address file. Now, how do you determine the placement of that point? They call it an address point, but is it really going to be on a structure? Is it going to be on an access point? So Nina has provided you an informational document that's available on their website to help you work through this process. And when you work through this process, you not only have to look at it from a next generation 911 standpoint, but be sure to look at it from a local response standpoint. Where is the location of that point going to best benefit our local response? Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time on GeoComm's Ask the Expert. Thank you.